Okay, good morning everybody. I'm going to get started now. We're going to be covering Saturday night and Sunday morning today, and it's an absolutely seminal text in terms of showing working class rebellion, working class resistance. And I'm going to be looking closely at Alan Sillitoe, and as I speak I'll do wider cultural history that will be focused mainly on post-war Britain, but I will also be talking about some links with other texts that we've studied, okay? I'm starting off with this first slide over here, and I'll tell you a little bit about it, okay? After the Second World War, obviously Britain was in a state of disrepair like most of Europe, okay? But very soon after the Second World War, you have an economic boom, which centers on the fact that there's lots of American money that gets put into Europe, something called the Marshall Plan. Those of you who do history here will know about it. And by the 1950s, in Britain, you have full employment. Okay, and that's very significant because, as a lot of you will know, that means lots of black and Asian people coming to Britain in order to fill this kind of labor shortage. And arguably the greatest transformation in British cultural identity there's ever been, other than maybe the Norman invasion. Okay. So you have this move towards Keynesian economics. You don't really need to know too much about that, other than to know that there's more of an idea in the UK that the state will look after you, and that there's a welfare state, a national health, and there's a kind of cautious optimism that things are getting better. Okay. With the Labour victory in particular, you have a sense of a much more empowered working class, a working class that are no longer going to be pushed around. And we looked at the Graham Greene story. Do you guys remember what it was called? Anybody? The Distractors. Yeah, do you remember the Distractors? And that seemed to me a very highly symbolic story. And maybe that's why we began this course by looking at that story. So you have Clement Attlee who takes over, who is himself from a working class background. And the actual phrase "from the cradle to the grave" was a phrase from Nye Bevan, who was the minister of the Secretary of State, actually, I think. And his job was to set up the National Health Service after the war. So he's a very influential character, okay? So you have a move towards more of an idea of a classless society, a move towards egalitarianism, very strongly influenced by American culture, as I showed you before. Do you remember that? We talked about the GIs during the war, and the idea that Americana signals a new kind of culture. In many ways, you know, signaled by things like pop music, by lowbrow culture or popular culture being taken much more seriously. In fact, using the term lowbrow is probably a very bad term to use. Probably an idea that popular culture gains more credibility, and it can't just be dismissed by people in power. One of the key things about postmodernism is it mixes the high with the low, okay? And then you also have, of course, feminism challenging the patriarchal system, the old system, and you have multiculturalism challenging this kind of imperial Britain, okay? So, the Butler Act in education, I'm not going to say too much about this. There's compulsory education until 16. By the 1950s, you have far more working class people going to university, and that becomes very important. You have a lot more night school. You have a lot more social mobility. You have working class people going to grammar schools as well. People like my father, who was the son of a miner, learning Latin, learning ancient Greek. So, you know, there's a real revolution in British society brought on by the Butler Act, okay? You also have two types of universities, okay? You've got the more traditional types of universities, and then you have the red brick universities, which were often not built in Oxford and Cambridge image at all. Much more radical universities, and these became the focus for like student protest, radical politics, feminism, cultural changes, you know, new degrees and things that are like, you know, post-colonial studies and stuff, yeah? All right, so after the war, you have this this move away from high versus low culture to a much more hybrid idea of culture, okay? And that, as I said, is about decentralization, Americanization, racial integration, and multiculturalism, okay? I'm just going to move past that. Now, the text that we're going to look at today, Saturday night, Sunday morning, is set in Nottingham in England. Now, in many ways, some of the industrial parts of the UK, my father's born in Burnley in Lancashire, Mr. Vizard is from the town next door to it. Those towns haven't really changed since Victorian times, okay? They're still built around an idea of a terraced house. There would be a local factory. Everybody would work there. Generation to generation would work there. A very settled idea of life. An idea of life that encouraged fatalism. You know, my dad worked there, I'm going to work there, my children will work there. Now, this is one of the things that gets attacked in post-war literature in a huge way. You also have this kind of sense in which the working class have a lot more money than they used to. Some of you may have come across this phrase before, you've never had it so good. Anyone heard of that before? The Harold Macmillan phrase, yeah, you've never had it so good. So you have like the birth of consumer society, you have much more of a leisure society, you have a much more of an idea of hedonism, that life should be about pleasure, leisure, self-fulfillment, not just about grind and doing what your parents did. All of this is going to be very important today, okay? Harold Macmillan's government that came in 1957 rode this post-war boom. So two things were happening. You've got a post-war boom, you've got more money, you've got Britain, very dominant Britain, having full employment. This is going to go through until the 70s when there's a massive change. And you also have decolonization going on. Another of Harold Macmillan's phrases is the winds of change. He said the winds of change are sweeping across Africa, sweeping across Asia. And so you've got African and Asian countries getting independence. Roshan, what year was Indian independence? 1947, I think it was, wasn't it, guys? At midnight, hence Salman Rushdie's very famous book, Midnight's Children, which is the story of Indian independence. Shame on you, Roshan. This will be published on YouTube. Okay, now, the angry young men who we've discussed in the past, okay? These are people like John Osborne, the famous play written by John Osborne was Look Back in Anger. Kingsley Amis, who wrote a very famous novel called Lucky Jim. You might want to look that up. It's a really good one to write about. But there are many people who fall into this category. It's this idea that young men who look on the past with disillusionment or absolute rage and anger, wanting to tear it down in many ways, okay? One of the people who falls into the category loosely of the angry young man is this guy, Alan Sillitoe. Left school at 14, joined the army, but went back after the war to university to study, wanted to write a new kind of literature that gave a voice to the working class and showed in particular kind of working class male anger. He was born in 1928, as I said, left school at 14. His first stories were published in the Nottingham Weekly Guardian, and in 1958, the text we're going to look at today, Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, was published. Later, an even more famous text called The Loneliness of the Long Distance Runner. For both of these, he won literary prizes, and these are famous texts that give voice, as I said, to the working class. One of the extracts I'm going to give you today is the introduction to Saturday Night and Sunday Morning, and this paragraph, this quotation comes from the introduction written by Alan Sillitoe. I had no theme in my head except the joy of writing, the sweat of writing clearly and truthfully. Notice he uses the term sweat and this idea of being truthful. So we've got a new kind of kitchen sink realism here. He wanted to portray ordinary people and in such a way that they would recognize themselves. Do you recognize A Taste of Honey? The same kind of quotation where Sheila Delaney wanted to actually capture the rhythms of working class speech. Do you remember that? Which hitherto had been ignored or parodied by wealthy people like Dickens. This took me a long time to achieve and was more difficult than one could imagine. So basically giving the idea that working class life is worth writing about, that it has to be written about realistically, and it has to be written not in an act of ventriloquism by literary people who went to college, but by the people themselves, using their own words, using their own lexical systems. It was made Saturday Night, Sunday Morning into an incredibly famous film. This was part of what we call New Wave British cinema which was about finding more authentic representations of working class life, quite risky. In the book, the main character is having an affair with Brenda, who's a much older woman. He's having sex with a married woman. And the film doesn't explicitly show this, but it shows scenes of them in bed together, etc. And it shows violence, it shows drunkenness, it shows loutishness. There's a new kind of verisimilitude that had previously been denied in literature. Okay. So the film starred a very, very famous guy called Albert Finney, and it then became a very popular play as well. Okay. Now it's time for us to watch a little bit of a movie. Oh.
Yeah. Everything goes all right about that? All right. Did you hear about the accident in the Free Speech shop today, Dad? No, not much. Another cup of tea there, love.
I got you some good seeing if it's Friday night.
This fella got his hand caught in that dress. He didn't know what he was doing. Of course, he's only got one eye. He must have sat at the other one looking at the telly day in and day out.
Okay, I just want to sum up that film clip. I want you to see that you've got the classic angry young man. You have the fact that he and his father have nothing in common. There's huge tension between an older, more obedient, more servile working class and a young, restless working class that are looking for more. Now, in British culture in particular, this is a massive genre. There are lots of films like Up the Junction, Cathy Come Home, Billy Liar, This Sporting Life. All of these are films in which you have a younger generation of working class people who are just so angry at the restrictions and limitations of their lives. It takes different forms. In the form of This Sporting Life, it takes the form of destructive drinking, sex, very similar to Saturday Night and Sunday Morning. It takes the idea of like binge drinking and affairs, etc. But then in Billy Liar, it takes a different idea. It takes an idea of a young man who lives in his imagination to escape, and he dreams of going to London. So London becomes a magnet for a lot of working class people. It becomes a kind of mythical place, a Dick Whittington place with roads paved with gold, in which people will go and transform themselves. So one of the big aspects of post-war British literature is the idea of transformation. That may be through imagination, that might be through subcultures like punk, etc., or pop music, or it might be through self-improvement and social mobility of working hard and changing. Some of you may know, for instance, Trainspotting, and you may think, like, that's a very different story, but is it really? Because that's about Edinburgh junkies, and some of you may recall that some of the junkies actually go to London and actually make a lot of money in Thatcher's Britain. So there's this idea in working class culture of transforming yourself, of not accepting your lot, of changing, either moving geographically or moving in terms of your class and your job, etc. Okay? So this idea of the angry young man who's not going to accept his lot, who's no longer obedient, who's anti-authority, who's quite subversive, it takes many different forms. But what it does do is it makes working class culture central to the arts.